Hi, this is Debbie, and today I'm going to be sharing how I mix my favourite muted watercolour palette. I often get asked what are my favourite watercolour shades and how I take those and mix up those soft, subtle shades that I love so much. So I'll be sharing my tips on how to achieve that, as well as no-line colouring this gorgeous rose. However, first I want to show you the new sets from Colorado Craft Company that have just been released, including the rose I used today. You can only get these exclusively from SYMPATHY for the next 2 days before general release. I'll leave links to these new sets as well as the rest of the supplies I've used today below in the video description. 3 of the new sets continue the unique Lovely Leg series from Colorado Craft Company: Fairy Magic, Wanderlust, and Enjoy Every Moment. However, there was a little mistake in the shipping, and instead of the latter set, I got 2 Wanderlust sets instead. The Enjoy Every Moment set is stunning, and please pop over to Simon in the link below to check out that set. In addition to the Lovely Legs line, Colorado Craft Company are also bringing out a new series called Big and Bold. These gorgeous large floral sets pack a big punch. One of the flowers would hang off the side of an A2 card, as I've done today, or equally fill a 5x5 card. The new sets in this series are Sympathy and Friendship Rose, Get Well Hydrangea, and Missing You Peony. Now, the great news is that I will be giving away these sets to 6 winners, 1 set each to 6 people. So please watch to the end of the video to find out how you can enter the giveaway. I love to use a range of watercolour media, but I'm most familiar with the Daniel Smith line of watercolour paints. The paints in this palette are the ones I use most frequently, and I have a dot sheet of these colours available at SYMPATHY if you would like to try them out before investing in the tubes. As you can see, I like to keep a messy palette, and I was recently asked how I keep contamination from one colour to the next when mixing. And as you can probably guess, I really don't worry about this. I love the colours you get from combining shades, and so if one colour ends up getting transferred into the next, then I'm happy to see what the result is. I've squeezed paint from tubes into this simple palette and then let them dry, and then when I want to paint, I reactivate the paints by using a dropper to add water to each well. Another way to do this is to use a mist of water from a spray bottle. One of my favourite colours is Quinacridone Coral, a rich, vibrant coral which dilutes down to the faintest pink. Now, when thinking of a muted colour palette, this shade is probably a bit bright, and so using the rules of colour theory, I add a touch of green to the mixture, and green being the complementary colour to red, knocks back the brightness. Complementary colours, when mixed, will eventually end up a muddy brown, so you don't need much of the complementary colour, just a touch to take the brightness away and get the muted shades I love. So you can see here that a tiny bit of undersea green to the Quinacridone Coral mixture takes the pink from a vibrant shade to a more vintage muted one. In exactly the same way, if I take undersea green and use it directly, you have a richer green shade compared to when mixing a tiny amount of Quinacridone Coral into the mixture, which results in a more khaki green. So when working on a muted colour palette, keep in mind your colour theory rules and add in a little of a paint's complementary colour to knock back brightness for a more subtle look. Okay, moving on, and I'm going to use some of the colours I've just mixed when painting this gorgeous large rose from the Sympathy and Friendship Rose set. I've aligned the image to hang slightly off the edge of a piece of cold pressed watercolour card. This card is slightly larger than an A2 card, and eventually I will trim it down to fit on the card front. That extra room does give me the ability to tape the card down to a board so that it doesn't warp when I add water. I stamped the image 3 times in antique linen distress ink to get a good impression of the lines to guide me when painting. Distress inks are water reactive, and so as I paint, the pale yellow of the ink will mix with the colours and disappear to give a no-line watercoloured look. I'm starting off painting at real-time speed here, and this card did take me over 2 hours to make in total. Now, for a special card such as this, when you're really wanting to let someone know you are thinking of them, then I think it's worth it. Also, I really enjoy painting, and I was excited to get going on this card, as I appreciate the large image. The size of the flower means that there is plenty of room to play around with adding shadows and highlights to the petals to bring this image to life. I say petals, but I often prefer to start with the leaves first, and this helps me to ground the image. I'll speed things up now, otherwise the video would be too long. I have the stamp set off to one side, and I'm using the printed image on the set to guide me as to where to add the deepest shades. I use my muted green mixture to add colour there, I then rinse my brush slightly and use the damp brush to draw the colour over the rest of the area, and in doing so diluting the colour as I went along. I also like to add in different colours too to give variations and interest, and so I added a little quinacridone gold in places to bring a warm glow to the leaves. I keep a paper towel or absorbent cloth close to hand and use this to draw off excess moisture from my brush. I then use the brush to mop up excess paint and also to draw paint away and so maintain highlights. I carried on painting in the same way, getting a base layer of colour down for the rest of the leaves, and then moved on to the petals. Moving back into real-time speed for this petal, I used the muted pink mixture and again painted the strongest concentration of colour in the areas indicated by the lines on the image. I then rinsed the brush and pulled out the colour over the rest of the petal, diluting the colour as I did so. I want to try and retain the highlights on the petals, those areas where the sun is catching the roundness of the petal as it comes from the shadows of the base of the petal before dipping over again towards the tip. I'm making sure to move the bristles of the brush over the stamped lines to reactivate the distress ink and blend it into the paint. Then with this layer of wet colour down, I can dip my brush back into the concentrated mixture and dot that along the line of the petal where the deepest shadows are. Watercolours will only spread through water, and so this wet on wet technique is a great way to get softly blended deeper colour into the shadows. Back to the speeded up version now, and basically I repeated the same process for each petal. Concentrated mixture along the shadow area, spread out with a damp brush, and then a little wet on wet to add more of the deeper colour into the shadows to gently blend out over the petal. I also kept my cloth to hand and used a damp brush to lift colour when trying to retain highlight areas. I repeated this process for each petal, but never painted one area directly next to another or the two areas would blend together. Once dry you can paint the next area, but not before or it will just turn into one pink blob. I kept a few petals really light in colour to add that variation which brings an image to life. I didn't want these petals to be without colour though, so I diluted the pink mixture right down and gave these the lightest petals, the faintest wash of colour. So at this point I have a base layer of colour over the leaves and petals, and you could stop there. However, from now on my aim was to add different colours, as after all, a leaf is not just solid green or a petal solid pink, and I also wanted to deepen the shadows. So I'll be adding all sorts of colours to the image. A little quinacridone gold for a warm glow, some purples in the shadows to cool things down a little. I'll bring in some ALIZARIN crimson for the deeper colours for the petals, and I'll mix an even deeper green by adding LUNAR black to my green mixture. On the leaves I'll also paint a deeper layer but leaving the veins of the leaves in the lighter base layer, because when I googled rose leaves they usually had paler veins. I'll play some music now while I continue painting and then I'll be back shortly. Splattered the card with white gouache, then a solution of perfect pearls, then the remains of my paint mixture, and finally with the iridescent gold paint. In my opinion, you can never have too many splatters and it adds that extra layer of texture. I slowly trimmed strips off the card edges until I had a panel just smaller than an A2 card base. I then nested a sentiment from the Sympathy and Friendship Rose set in the perfect spot and treated the card with an anti-static powder bag, as I'm going to heat emboss the greeting and the powder will help prevent embossing powder randomly sticking everywhere. I stamped the greeting several times in clear embossing ink to ensure a good impression on the textured watercolour card, and then sprinkled antique gold embossing powder from SYMPATHY stamp over the top and heat set. I used a deep red FABER pencil to add more depth to a few petals, and then a black and deep green pencil to add the same to the leaves. Finally, I added white gouache to brighten some of the petal highlight areas, and I do find all these little details add up to give an image with more variation between those shadows and highlights, and so give the appearance of more dimension. I added foam adhesive to the back of the watercolour panel and added it to a side folding card base, cut and scored from NEENAH Desert Storm card in the £110 weight for sturdiness. I recently am in love with the Dream Drops from Nouveau. I love the iridescent shimmer and shine and seem to add them to all of my projects at the moment. Today I pulled out Love Potion, Dragon Scales and Fairy Wings and added droplets dotted around the petals and leaves. I added a few crystal gems from Nouveau too as the final touch, and that completes this no-line watercoloured rose using a muted watercolour palette. Okay, so back to the giveaway. Leave a comment on the coordinating blog post. I'll put a link below and I will draw the names of 6 winners. Leave your comments by Friday the 7th of June, 11:59 p.m. Eastern, and I'll email the winners over the weekend. I'll leave you with links in the YouTube description below to the products that I've used today, as well as a link to the coordinating blog post over at limedoodledesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you've enjoyed this tutorial, I'd be delighted if you subscribe to this channel. Also, if you'd like to get notified when a new video is out, don't forget to hit the bell button next to the subscribe button too. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.